Hi everyone, I'm Eli Lake, Washington Times, New Republic, and I'm with Heather Hurlburt, who I think you might have seen yesterday on Blocking Heads, and who's the executive director of the National Security Network. And I'm going to toast my Diet Coke. If it was later, I would toast something more potent. Bin Laden is dead, Heather. Yay.
Bin Laden is dead, Eli, and are we ready to seize the post Bin Laden world? To me, that's the big question today. What are the possibilities of the post Bin Laden world, and are we as a country, left and right, ready to seize it?
I agree, but let's just take a moment to just savor the fact that this scumbag is no more.
Yeah, I'm with. There's actually a wonderful bit of, if I can make the Blogging Heads viewers indulge me in a little bit of biblical commentary. You know, there's this wonderful bit of commentary that actually God got really angry at the Israelites for celebrating after Pharaoh's army was driven into the sea, and that some of the reason that folks have to wander in the desert quite so long has to do with God being angry and saying, you know, what's wrong with you? They were made in my image too. So,
well, yeah, but the Haggadah, the same passage also instructs the Israelites to pour out their wrath upon the Pharaoh.
Yeah, sometimes you have to do what you have to do. I'm not shedding any tears for the guy. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, yeah, that's a trigger I think I could have pulled, actually, but I personally don't view it as a cause for celebration. I mean, also, frankly, because he's dead, and that doesn't bring anybody back that was killed by him and his people and his ideas. You know, it doesn't restore anyone who was killed on 9/11 or any of the Muslims that were killed all over the world by his people. So what's to celebrate?
To celebrate is the death of an evil man, the death of somebody who clearly, as I'm reporting and others are, had still strategic command of Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, was going to do more harm. The fact that he's dead could do less harm, or he's, you're stopping evil. I mean, I don't think you should get carried away with it.
I don't celebrate death.
What?
I don't celebrate death, I said.
Well, I don't know. I think it's an important victory, and I was really moved by the spontaneous kind of gathering in front of the White House on Sunday night. When the news was sort of eking out on the internet. It was a very nice kind of patriotic moment, and it was interesting was a lot of those people were very young. They were George Washington University students. They were probably half their lives has been spent. The U.S. has been trying to find Osama bin Laden, and I think it is a moment for celebration. Not, I mean, I agree with you that it's never, you shouldn't get caught up in it in the sense of, that. You shouldn't celebrate the kind of brutality or but I think it's an unmitigated victory for the United States, the civilized world, and even I think greater Islam. I think it's a good thing that this man is dead, and he can no longer terrorize people, and his existence terrorized people. So the thing that I think is worth celebrating is the fact that somebody who did terrorize people is dead, and he died as a coward.
So Eli, I will admit that when I was sure that was what it was, I shrieked and jumped off the sofa, and I will admit to having sort of a surprised moment of sheer joy. I don't necessarily think that's one of my finest qualities, but I will admit to having it. But I do think kind of what's a bigger problem is that anytime, we are this enormously powerful, wealthy, influential society, and anytime we're that caught up with the life and death of one person, something's gone wrong somewhere. And it's just, with the feeling of joy, I mean, I felt great joy. I also felt great sadness as I thought about, some of the 9/11 families that I know and all the people that I don't know. And then I just think, what does it, and I think that the bigger question is, as a society, can we get past our fascination with this one guy? And then, more broadly, does it enable us to refocus, on what are the real threats and challenges to us as a society? Does it enable us politically to do what experts have been asking us to do for a couple of years now, which is to recognize that a lot has changed in the world, and that maybe the way our national security establishment is set up is now a little skewed based on something that happened almost 10 years ago?
I want to get to that, and that's a good question. I will say that I worked. I mean, I had to file. So, I mean, I was happy, but I was quickly changed to I need to get as many details as I can and confirm this and and file and kind of coordinate with the rest of the editors of the Washington Times. And I've kind of been in a straight reporting mode really for the last 36 hours, and this is a nice little break to talk about it. But I was moved by the kind of outburst of patriotism that I saw outside of the White House, and in a lot of my friends who kind of contacted me. It was a nice kind of way to kind of get closure, and I agree with you that it's not healthy to fixate on the gory details of another life taken, but at the same time, this man terrorized the world, and he's dead now, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, I guess there's a lot of implications now of obviously Bin Laden's death, and maybe let me ask you, why don't you tease out a little bit about what you mean by we can focus on other things besides, I guess you're saying terrorism?
So if you were a Martian and you landed on Earth right now, if you were a Martian and you landed in Washington and you looked around this society and you said to yourself, okay, what are the greatest international challenges to this? What are the greatest challenges to this society from the way it has to live on the planet with other societies? And frankly, number one is, can we get our economy moving again? And how do we create ourselves as a new and different kind of global engine that creates both wealth but also jobs and honorable livelihoods for our citizens, in an economy that isn't like the economy of 50 years ago, where you have China and increasingly India and others as peer competitors in some way. So that, is a kind of fundamental challenge in terms of both the economic wherewithal to do everything else and our stature in the world and, feelings of dignity and confidence for our citizenry. And that's a challenge that has little or nothing to do with Islamic extremism centered around the Middle East and South Asia. So that's sort of number one. Number two, you have a set of challenges, of which, frankly, terrorism is one. But terrorism not so much centered on one man, Osama bin Laden. So terrorism is one, climate change is another, some sets of health issues that really have to be contended with in a global framework. Then you have, a set of nuclear challenges that are really serious, Iran, North Korea, and so on. And then you have the problem of the 2.5 wars that we're facing and what to do with, the remnants of an Islamic extremist organization, which remains serious and a real threat to us, but not the kind of global peer competitor that we built Al-Qaeda up to be in our minds after 9/11.
Okay, I want to just go back to something that you said. I know that under the Clinton administration, the issue of terrorism was in a file called Transnational Threats, TNT, that included, I guess, piracy and human trafficking and disease pandemics. And are you saying you would like to see terrorism? First of all, I don't understand how global climate change has anything to do with counterterrorism. I just don't.
Okay, can you pause there for just a second, Eli? Because sure. It doesn't have anything to do with. They don't have anything to do with each other in the sense that the ways you have to respond to them are sui generis. What they do have to do with each other is they share the characteristic that we can't fight them, we can't contend with them without the participation of other societies. When we work on our own, it doesn't work, it doesn't solve the problem, A. And B, that whether we like it or not, in the global commons, there are a range of issues that different countries prioritize differently. We happen to prioritize terrorism above pretty much everything else. That's not true of many of the societies whose partnership we need. And therefore, because we live in a global commons, because we don't, live off on Mars by ourselves, we have to find ways of trading off and saying to other countries, okay, we'll focus on your priorities, you focus on ours. And so that's how those transnational issues are interlinked, because we have to gain the political capital and the partnership to deal with them in something of a global marketplace. And it has to be okay to say that and not pretend that everyone else feels the same way about terrorism that we do, because they just don't. And the more we're honest about it, the more we'll actually be able to get the cooperation that we need.
I completely, maybe I'm not following it, but we just saw a raid where ostensibly a close ally, though we can talk about Pakistan, was not informed until the very last minute of teams of highly trained Navy SEALs going into a compound in a town that has been described as equivalent of Pakistan's West Point, a very developed area, and an incredibly lethal raid. And the reason that information was not shared with the Pakistanis is because obviously they probably would have shared it with bin Laden, or that was the fear, and they managed to have a pretty successful operation unilaterally in that case.
Right, but everybody, Eli, you and I and everybody else who opens their mouth on the topic agrees that killing bin Laden and the kind of operation that killed bin Laden is not, it's not enough by itself to end the threat of terrorism, that you have to do a whole range of things, most of which, the financing, the ground operations where you have something like Afghanistan, the tracking operations. So that's one thing. The bin Laden operations, the exception, not the norm. Point two is that what we saw and all the cool stuff with the Navy SEALs and how cool is it that Barack Obama can say go and watch them on a little camera and they go seemingly all by themselves. This is the culmination of 9 years of work across administration. And if you look at how the work was done, there were interrogations in different countries. There were collection operations in different countries. There was the buying of information from sources in different countries. There was endless work on the ground in Pakistan for which we had to have at least a minimally collaborative relationship with the Pakistanis so we could get the guys in there. So it's this little fantasy that all we need is Navy SEAL teams is really nice, but it doesn't even reflect.
That's not what I was saying. I was just saying that
right, but it's not. This wasn't
unilaterally.
No, but it wasn't done unilaterally. It was built on a foundation of intelligence that was collected multilaterally. And I also, and neither you nor I knows the truth of this, so we can kind of spout off about it endlessly if we like. But are you really telling me that given where bin Laden was located, that really the Pakistanis had no idea that we were closing in on him, that nobody in Pakistan had noticed this?
Well, there's differing accounts.
Yeah, we'll figure this out.
But according to John Brennan, he said that they went in without informing the Pakistani government. I'm basing that on John Brennan.
Right, but so here, this is, and again, I do not have any secret sources on this, but you can at least plausibly imagine that, in fact, some people in Pakistan figured out that we were closing in on bin Laden and also realized that there was nothing they were going to be able to do about it this time, or that tipping him off, that he had actually become, and this to me is the really interesting question, why had he become more of a liability than an asset to the Pakistanis? And so, yeah, I absolutely believe we didn't tell them exactly when we were going to do it. And in fact, you can kind of imagine the phone call that would have been placed to Zardari and to, what's his name, Kayani, the head of the Army or the head of Intel Services. Hi, so our helicopters just landed. So people may have picked up a boom in your area. You'll want to make sure that no inquisitive policemen or fire trucks show up. And then you'll want to start thinking about what you're going to say in about 2 hours.
Yeah, all of that. I mean, but that I'm saying.
But none of that, Eli, obviates the fact that we live in a world with other countries and that dealing with issues that cross borders takes place in somewhat of a marketplace environment. And that we have some unilateral tools we can deploy. We have more unilateral tools than a lot of people do, but we also have more multilateral needs than a lot of people. So
I guess on the multilateral, on the question of Pakistan, it's a little bit of a, Pakistan is such a unique case because on the one hand, the side of the government that is threatened by Al-Qaeda, it's far higher a priority terrorism than it is even for us. So if you're in the part of the ISI or the part of the Pakistani military that is threatened every day by Al-Qaeda and other jihadist networks, then I can't imagine the Pakistanis would say, I wish you would talk more about global warming. And then the other side of Pakistan are clearly just on the other side. And so the reason that they wouldn't cooperate, and they've foiled cooperation in the past, is because they themselves are more aligned with kind of Al-Qaeda and the wider jihadist threat.
But Eli, you're deliberately conflating what I said, okay? Because what we are now talking about Pakistan more broadly. I think you and I would agree that a world in which the U.S. was less enmeshed in Pakistan's internal politics would be a good world. That a world in which we conceived of our fundamental interests as requiring less enmeshment with Pakistan would be good. And so, frankly, that's a world where we refocus away from thinking that issues that are central to Pakistan are also quite as central to us, and where we refocus away from thinking that terrorism in that part of the world is the most important threat we face. And when we refocus away from Pakistan and that part of the world, then we're back in a situation where you're in a transactional international community with a variety of threats that different nations place different importance on. Now, having said that, it's also the case that because Pakistan has nuclear weapons, is soon going to be the world's largest Muslim country, and has some very, very problematic real estate, and because we have troops in Afghanistan, and because we continue to have interests and concerns there, we're going to be enmeshed with Pakistan for the foreseeable future. And that, I think, is an ugly reality, and there's going to be an ugly debate about that in the U.S. because people are understandably angry about these revelations. But we're not going to get unenmeshed with Pakistan anytime soon, which means we are going to have to continue to struggle with how we deal productively with the debate you described, that Pakistan has both some government officials who are the people most threatened by extremist terrorism and other government officials who are actively aiding and abetting extremist terrorism.
Right. So so we agree that Pakistan is not a typical case
of
a country that you would consider in terms of multilateral transactional.
No, it would be a better world if we could put Pakistan in that category, but we can't, and that's not happening anytime soon.
All right. Well, then let me make the counter in a different way. Right. Since 9/11, the military has adopted a kind of unsaid doctrine of that basically in ungoverned spaces they have, I guess, given itself the right that's legally based on the 9/14 resolution right after 9/11 attacks, to conduct violent operations, surveillance operations, all over the world, but particularly in places where there isn't a strong central authority. And that means that, there are drone attacks and other special operations raids in places like Chad or Somalia or Yemen, and that this has kind of been the U.S. posture more and more on counterterrorism, and that while a lot of it's intelligence cooperation and detective work, there's certainly a financing element to it as well, that a lot of the sort of tip of the spear is done through special operations in secret and in places that don't have either strong central governments or there's no real law. And it's an open question, and I was trying to ask people this yesterday. Does that continue? Because that's very different than the world before 9/11. And that's also, I don't think, particularly multilateral in the sense that you need it.
Eli, this is a funny thing. I have this, but it's less different from the world before 9/11 than maybe we would like to pretend that it is. It's different in scale, and it's different in justification. But the fact of the matter is that the U.S., and not just the U.S., other countries that have the ability to project power in that way, the British, the French, the Israelis, to a lesser extent the Russians, a few others, the South Africans, have always done that. And none of them have any intention of giving it up. And none of them, frankly, thought they needed a UN resolution to justify doing it. What's new and different is that
the drones are much different now. Drones were rarely used before 9/11, and they're now ubiquitous.
Right, and you also have people ask. One of the really fascinating things is that you have Libyans asking for drones, and the whole question. I'd set the drones aside as a little bit of a separate category, just because I think that's evolving so quickly. But I think it's. The 9/11 changed everything argument, I just don't buy. What I do think
it did Eli, in the sense that...
Eli, so what I do think changes is that so after 9/11, the U.S. has felt very comfortable about saying not only are we going to do this, but we're going to do it publicly. We're not going to be embarrassed about it, and we're going to assert that we have international support and justification for it, legal justification for it, as you said. I think actually killing bin Laden is going to make it harder to assert that. And I think this, ties back to a domestic political point as well, which is that there's a lot of things that Americans understood that we were doing because bin Laden, who represents this whole scary idea that there's a global threat out there of something that's somehow close to being equal in might to the power of the U.S. government and has the ability to fundamentally disrupt the functioning of U.S. society. With bin Laden's death, it's clear to everybody, or it's clear to everybody until people start trying to obfuscate it. And I think there's an interesting, there's this whole discussion about bin Laden's successor that started to emerge today. And that's an important development, particularly regionally, but it's not as if Zawahiri or whoever it is succeeding to al-Qaeda the way we knew al-Qaeda in 2001 or 2002. So if you don't actually have and if it's recognized that you don't have a global, unified organization that poses a threat, not just to the lives of groups of Americans, which is significant and real, but to the cohesion of our society and our state, then is there the same level of justification for some of these things that there was when we could claim, rightly or wrongly, but we did make the claim with great aggressiveness that we were facing a fundamental threat to the cohesion of our state?
Well, that's the justification, but I would like to get back to also multilateralism and counterterrorism, and that is that...
I'm really going to be kicking myself all day for having used the word multilateralism with you, aren't I, Eli? It's just like a damn presidential debate. I did the liberal thing, and I walked right into it.
No, well, I'm not trying to win a debate here. I'm just saying that there was another thing that I think it's worth pointing out, which is that the wave of democratic movements and uprisings in the Middle East, and we don't know kind of where they're going to turn to, but it's changed fundamentally our relationship with Egypt, with Tunisia, and I think, and also the states that haven't tipped over yet. And the dynamic is twofold. One, there is a price that the United States paid for covert counterterrorism cooperation in Egypt and other places, which is that I think it really did, more than anything else, earn the enmity of the populations there. The U.S. was, and we've talked about this before, silent partners in many ways the oppression of lots of Arabs because of these counterterrorism relationships, and I think you would agree with that. Yep. And secondly, because Obama, in the end, and I don't criticize him for this, used American influence and publicly asked for Mubarak to step down, I have to imagine, and I've heard this, that other American clients, from Jordan to Pakistan, saw that and kind of recalibrated where they're coming from. I asked this question of Jake Sullivan last week, which is, are you concerned that other unelected leaders in the Middle East would be looking at the example of Egypt and Tunisia and, to a lesser extent, I guess, Libya, and conclude that when there is democratic pressure in our towns, in our public squares, the U.S. will probably not side with the dictatorship? And in the end, I think that's a very good thing. And Reagan, in the end, did not support Marcos. Yeah, and lots of Democrats and Republicans did not. But I also think that has an effect on the ability to do traditional cooperation on counterterrorism. It's had an effect, and I think that's an important point, too.
So, two things. A government official put it I really liked this formulation. And the way he said it to me in an off-the-record setting was, so we have these commitments with a number of regimes in the Middle East to defend them. And what has now emerged is that the regimes didn't differentiate between being defended from external threats and being defended from internal democracy movements. And they were surprised that we, in fact, didn't see defending them from internal democracy movements as something we had signed up to when the U.S. signed up to defend them from external threats. And so that there is no question that there is that bewilderment, there is that anxiety, that we're paying a significant price for that. And we're paying a significant price for that in terms of how the tightrope that the administration is trying to walk, on Bahrain, on Syria, even on Yemen. So, But
there's no deal with
Eli,
Syria.
here's the question.
We don't have the same relationship with Syria.
So
They're an
I think
adversary.
I see where there's a short-term cost to be paid, particularly with Egypt, where the Egyptian government is asserting itself in ways that are very hard for Israel to deal with, and that it's going to lessen our leverage with Israel in the short term, is going to increase Israel's anxiety level, and is going to make it harder to do the things like work toward a peace deal, which actually would help everybody the most in the region in the long run, and would frankly sideline the extremists most in the long run. So there's a significant short-term cost, and you can't wish it away. Although the other side of it, of course, is it's not clear that sort of the old Egyptian government was going to be able to deliver anything that really mattered. So there's that. I don't see, and I don't know, I guess I want to ask you to cite your sources on this. It's not totally clear to me that counterterrorism cooperation is disrupted or stalled in any significant way.
I can give you an example right now.
Okay.
There were a series of, well, I don't want to call them jailbreaks, because we don't know if they were just let out of the jails, but lots of people got out of high-security prisons in Egypt in the first days and weeks of the uprising.
But that's not, Eli, that's not a break in cooperation.
Wait a second. The transitional regime has been asked by the United States to monitor and in some cases rearrest certain people who were considered to be particularly bad that were affiliated with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad that have been highlighted by Zawahiri in his latest address on Egypt. And there so far they haven't been arrested. Now, I don't have access to all the information, but there has been concern in that. And the other thing is that the visibility in general that the United States had with the Egyptian military is not what it was before the revolution.
Okay, so two things. First, can you cite or give afterward a source for that so that readers can sort of look at it and think about it for
I'm working
themselves?
on a story right now which will touch on this issue.
Okay, but Eli,
I get to tell you that, I'm a reporter. I talk to people on background all the time, and
I just wanted to establish that that's what the source is. And second, Eli, is it really such a bad thing for the U.S. relationship with the Egyptian military to be less visible? Because exactly part of the cost that you and I were talking about a few minutes ago is how incredibly visible it was that the U.S. was propping up the Israeli military.
You misread me. When I say less visibility, I mean that the United States knew everything that was going on in the Egyptian military because it had flawless, I guess you could say it had so many points of contact and it had a very good relationship with the leadership, and it doesn't have the same relationship that it does today. And
Eli,
also, there's another huge problem with the Obama administration.
Eli, back up. The Egyptian military leadership is the same people it was 3 months ago.
It's true that it's the same people that it was 3 months ago, but they're not as cooperative with the United States, particularly since many people who are affiliated on other elements of the security side of the Egyptian government looked at how, in some ways, willing... I'm just saying what I'm hearing here is that there's less cooperation or visibility into everything that's happening in the Egyptian military than there was before. And part of that's because the Egyptian military leadership, particularly Field Marshal Tantawi, is in the process of making his own decisions right now as to what's going to happen. And it's I think
so again,
the US
in the long
goals
term,
in this, which are kind of unclear
that's
for
a
Egypt.
good thing.
Well, how is that a good thing? Because if Egypt continues to be a military dictatorship, except it's neutral with the United States as opposed to very much affiliated with it, I always thought that at the end, the U.S. could use its leverage more in the sense that, all of the spare parts for the Egyptian military would stop if they decided to really align themselves in a significant way with the so-called resistance bloc. However, my understanding is that a lot of the diplomacy in Cairo in particular has been stalled because, as we both know, the ambassador, Scobie, is on her way out, and this new woman, Ann Patterson, is supposed to be replacing her, and that's got to move forward. So there's a bit of confusion on that end. That's what I've heard.
Yeah, so first of all, if we think that in the long term an Egyptian military dictatorship wasn't sustainable, therefore not in the U.S. interest, therefore to get to something that is sustainable and with which the U.S. can build a relationship that's net positive, one of the things that you have to go through is that you move from being a client state of the U.S. into a relationship that's more sustainable because it's more comfortable and respectful, for want of a better word, on both sides. And again, there are short-term costs. This isn't easy. But if you're serious about wanting to live in a world, and that you think ultimately a world is most sustainable where states have truly sovereign governments that can sort of earn the respect of their citizens and talk to other sovereign governments in a mutually respectful way, then this is what has to happen. I mean, they can't be.
Well, I mean, we're in agreement, Heather. I don't disagree with any of the decisions in the end that Obama made. I think that it was time for Mubarak to go. The question is, will Mubarak leaving Egypt mean that there will be the emergence of a more accountable democratic government, or will it just mean another military dictatorship? And that we'll have to find out in the coming months as Egypt prepares for an election. And so ultimately, I want to see Egypt graduate to sovereignty and move away from being a military dictatorship. I think in their long-run and medium-term benefits outweigh the short-term costs. But on the narrow point of the short-term, the narrow point of U.S. treating terrorism as one of many transnational threats in a transactional relationship with other countries in the global commons, the closest relationship the United States has had pre and post 9/11 on issues of counterterrorism are with governments in the Middle East that have either fallen or could be teetering in this Arab Spring, and that I think augurs in the short term on just the point of treating of kind of cooperation on counterterrorism will mean that the United States will have to be more unilateral in the short term in that respect than multilateral.
But yeah, I really reject that premise for two reasons. One, I think it's actually important to say that it's not entirely clear that some of the intelligence collaborations with some of the governments you're talking about did more good than harm. They may very well, even in the short term, have done more harm than good. And I think your comments about Egypt are a great example. So there's an argument to be made, and I mean this is a hard argument, and there are serious trade-offs. And I know, intel professionals feel like they got good information that saved lives, and I don't want to seem to take that lightly. But there are also serious costs and serious recruitment bonanzas that were given to terrorist organizations because of who we were affiliated with. So I think that has to be factored into the equation. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that overall, in the last few years, U.S. intelligence cooperation with friends and allies has gone up dramatically, in part because partner governments had more confidence that we weren't torturing, that there was less sort of free and happy use of extraordinary rendition, and that there was more seriousness about the conditions of people that we were arresting and prosecuting.
That gave more cooperation because they were confident we were not torturing?
First and foremost, the Europeans. Okay.
I'm going to call bullshit on that. I'll tell you why I'm going to call bullshit on that.
Sorry, I got one more thing to say. Actually, to come back to our earlier conversation, Pakistan. That the quality of cooperation with Pakistan, as bad and crummy and unsatisfying and frustrating and sporadic as it is, has been much better over the last couple of years than it was in the years preceding. And that has everything to do with a assertive effort on the part of the United States to reach out and change the tone and content of the partnership.
Okay, I'm going to challenge both of those points. On the Pakistan point, I think all evidence suggests that's totally wrong. And the reason it suggests it's wrong, and I'm not saying that it was great under Bush, and this is not a defense of Bush, but Pakistan has been slowly, U.S. counterterrorism relationship with Pakistan has been slowly but surely spiraling into a bad place. How can what you say square with the trial of Raymond Davis, for example? How can that square with the suspicions about how elements of the Pakistanis may have burned us in the coast bombing at the end of 2009? And by all accounts, we've seen. Hold on, let me finish. By all accounts, we've seen spilling out in public the fact that the head of the Pakistani ISI and other senior Pakistani officials have been asking for a fundamental rethink of that relationship. And if the relationship was better than it was before, then why did, according to John Brennan, the United States not tell the Pakistanis about the raid on bin Laden's compound until it was too late? So,
okay, Eli, stop. So the counters to that are, first of all, the Zazi case and the Zazi investigation and how quickly that was followed up with serious cooperation in Pakistan that netted suspects. Second, David Headley. So Zazi is so David Headley is was wanted, was captured, interrogated in connection with the Mumbai bombings, and there was some serious and somewhat unexpected cooperation with Pakistani authorities on that case. Now, I think it's possible to say how some of what you're squaring, particularly the Davis incident, which for folks who don't follow this obsessively is the American intel contractor who shot two guys on the street in circumstances that remain somewhat murky. So I think the Davis case has precipitated a serious decline. So there's been ups and downs even over the past couple of years, and it's not a one-way street either up or down. But we've also been able to for every sort of problem that you've named, there have also been instances where we've been able to make serious progress. And I don't think there's been a moment in the last 15 years where if the U.S. were carrying out an operation like the bin Laden one, they would have told the Pakistani government in advance. So that's just kind of a permanent secular factor that's independent of the ups and downs of the relationship.
Okay, and then on the question of, torture, meaning that you've gotten, listen, the original black sites were in Europe. European intelligence services, at least, knew all about it and participated in the program. We now know from WikiLeaks files. Yeah. They sent many people
true.
there.
That's totally true, and it doesn't contradict what I said.
Well, okay, but how is it that Europeans would be participating in prisons where there was torture, and and so they were clandestinely participating in it. But then when the new administration said we're not going to do that anymore, that's one thing.
That's not the timeline. The timeline is that European intelligence services were participating in a range of practices that their own governments and peoples considered unacceptable. This got found out during the Bush administration, and the cooperation got shut down during the Bush administration. It became possible. When the Bush administration started rolling back some of the most objectionable practices, cooperation started to pick up. When the Obama administration when Obama went out publicly and said, we're not going to torture, we're going to apply uniform standard of interrogation and the other executive orders, that made it possible to officially re-expand cooperation, to talk about it more, and for intelligence services to be able to go back to their own parliamentary and governmental overseers and say, see, it's okay for us to be doing this now because the administration has turned the page on the previous behavior. So that's how those two things go together.
When the Obama administration threatened its own intelligence cooperation with the MI6 over revelations of the treatment of Binyam Mohammed, this happened under President Obama and was approved at the highest levels of that administration. I've heard that European, especially French and German intelligence cooperation with the United States has its own track, which is independent of the political track. And finally, as for the intelligence cooperation with the Middle Eastern or Pakistani, they employ torture against their own citizens for effectively, political crimes that have nothing to do with terrorism. And in that respect, I just can't imagine that, what Obama says about it, would have an effect on that.
But Eli, you're kind of ignoring the way the world actually works. You're applying a level of consistency, or you're expecting a level of consistency that just doesn't exist. And in European societies like ours, yes, intelligence agencies try as much as possible to have their own tracks and be totally insulated from the political processes. In some cases, they're more successful than others. In some cases, public outrage or government outrage forces some changes in programming. So that's point one, and you can go back and look up how that happened, with the revelations about torture in the U.S. And in the case of the Middle East, yes, these governments employ torture against their own citizens. They're inconsistent, and they enjoy or many of them did enjoy, employing torture against their own citizens and at the same time whipping up their citizens to be angry at the U.S. when the U.S. employed torture. So, yeah, guess what? Do I contradict myself? Yes, I contradict myself. I mean,
it just sounds to me like it's just too simple. It sounds to me like something that liberals would like to tell themselves, that Obama, when he ended torture and made these big announcements in the executive order in the first
well, actually, Eli, it's something that European governments like to tell.
Counterterrorism cooperation.
Eli, it's something that European governments like to say. It's not something that I like to say to myself. It's something that I hear from European parliamentarians, from European reporters that I talk to. So,
okay, well, I would like to hear from European intelligence professionals about this. And I would like to hear, and I talk to other U.S. intelligence professionals, and while I never asked the question exactly like this, my understanding is that the cooperation, particularly with the French and the Germans, on Iran and counterterrorism has been fairly consistent. And the fact that the U.S. publicly threatened the actual U.S.-British intelligence relationship, the closest ally of the CIA, the cousins as they're known, because details of Binyam Mohammed's treatment would be exposed in public in trial would and apparently that that went forward and it didn't necessarily. I mean, my understanding is the British-U.S. relationship remains pretty good. I guess it seems to me that it's something that I'm sure that European politicians would say, just as I'm sure Democrats would like to say it, but I don't know that it reflects the reality of an often secret and somewhat grizzled world. And the other thing is this.
But Eli, I'm sorry, but with all due respect, if when you're talking about French and German U.S. intel cooperation over Iran, that is a different matter. And so you are mixing apples and oranges there. So
you're saying that the Germans, but I mean, I've heard it as well beyond Iran. I've heard it that they've been cooperative on other things as well.
But we're not pursuing. I think. You are mixing apples and oranges because the kind of cooperation that we have with respect to Iran doesn't imply trying to arrest people by and large. So anyway, but I think we should actually get back to Bin Laden a little bit for the last 8 or 10 minutes here. And I think one of the things that's occupying a lot of imagination is what does this mean? What does this mean for the war in Afghanistan? So what's your view on what this means for the war in Afghanistan?
Well, President Obama told Harry Reid, according to Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, that the withdrawal timeline would remain as it was before the capture of Bin Laden. I talked to Matthew Ho, who is the executive director of something called the Afghan Study Group and a former Marine major who believes the United States should get out of Afghanistan, and he thought that this was something that would have a political effect in trying to focus, the or the kind of get out of Afghanistan crowd or withdrawal troops from Afghanistan crowd, that it would add political momentum. I would just add this. I asked Matthew Ho, who I think is a pretty intelligent guy, how he feels about this kind of special operations model, which I would say appears pretty unilateral and doing these kinds of special operations things. And that seems to be what he favors. And it seems that the anti-Afghan war coalition that's put together, at least in Washington among policymakers, includes a group of people that are kind of coming from the right that would like to see this kind of post-9/11 increased presence all over the world of special operations forces continue in lieu of nation building in Afghanistan. And ironically, the Afghanistan war mission at this point is at least traditionally more small L liberal in terms of institution building and all the things you need to do for counterinsurgency, than maybe sort of how the politics are reflected right now.
Well, just for the record, small L liberals don't think that you do nation building with the military. Neocons think you do nation building with the military. Liberals think you do nation building with
neocons like Barack Obama. Neocons like Barack Obama.
No, Barack Obama doesn't think we're nation building. Anyway, but actually, Eli, I think there's a fundamental there's a point to be made before we start talking about the political context back here in the U.S., which is that there's reason to hope, but there's reason to hope and there's also reason for pessimism about whether the passing of bin Laden makes it easier and more fruitful to conduct political talks with elements of the Taliban that are willing to be reintegrated into some kind of Afghan government that can start providing the grounds for stability without an endless presence of U.S. troops. And so that to me is the first question, because there's some possibility of it cutting both ways, both that it gives the U.S. some shock and awe, some momentum, On the other hand, there's a possibility that it heightens fragmentation, that it allows new leaders to emerge. So you just don't know. But that seems to me to be the sort of on-the-ground, substantive question that actually matters, independent of the political jockeying back here that you're describing. So that's kind of my first thing to watch very closely. And then second, as you said, I think the other sort of interesting political tea leaf that I read yesterday was Senator Levin, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, saying that he expected initial withdrawals to go ahead this summer and that he expected them to be, I think the word he used was substantial. So, it seems to me that that there's both, that there's a desire, I think those who think that this is going to produce a prompt rush to the exits in Afghanistan are going to be disappointed. But there's also a renewed willingness among the Reeds and Levins of the world to say to the administration, okay, you said you wanted an inflection point this summer. You said you're committed to political negotiations that let us move toward the exits now. Now let's see you do it. Because there's no question, by the way, I mean, an interesting political development is that on the right, you had Haley Barbour trying to see whether he could establish okay, it's time to move for the exits in Afghanistan position and make a credible run for the presidency. And he dropped out for reasons that don't have anything to do with his Afghanistan stance. But you now don't have, you have a bunch of, everybody from Walter Jones to Ann Coulter on the right talking about it being time to get out of Afghanistan, but you don't have a mainstream presidential candidate. Lugar sort of walked up to this, has walked back a little bit. You don't have a mainstream Republican enunciating that view right now.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, but a lot of the Republicans that would have been closer to the Steve Clemons coalition, they were neutral or they supported Obama in 2008, which gives them less credibility, I think, within the Republican Party. But on this question, I mean, I just feel that, this is Obama. Obama has been the one that called for the escalation. Obama will be the one that will call ultimately for the de-escalation, and that's Barack Obama. And I think that, I don't know, I think that it was in some ways like the Bush administration was a gift for a lot of liberals because it allowed them to sort of focus everything on like the neocons and this and that. But this is, he's got all the information, Heather. He's making that decision. And at the end of the day, he's pursued, at least in parts, this counterinsurgency strategy, which is the idea, build a better police force, build a better, social services. If you read the Afghan War Report, it's all about nation building. It says we want to be able to increase the capacity of local governments to deliver basic social services. And he's doing it through the military. And, there is a State Department surge there as well, but it's mainly the military. And it's not that different from what Bush tried to do in the new strategy after 2007 in Iraq, in the broad brushstrokes. And while the reconciliation that you're talking about with the Taliban, I think is very important, it happens on the terms that the U.S. kind of dictates. It's not like a negotiation. So, we'll see. And it's ultimately
actually, Eli, so in fact, some of what has to happen is a real negotiation among Afghans, which the U.S. can to some extent set the terms of, but can't actually dictate the outcome of. And by the way, not just Taliban and Karzai, but getting other forces back involved as well and really genuinely negotiating. And in a way, I mean, in general, I think the analogies to Iraq can mislead as much as they inform. I'll now abuse the privilege and say, that you had genuine, really ugly and long, dragged out negotiations among Iraqis to get to where we are now, and you're going to have genuine negotiations among Afghans, and it's a mistake to say, oh well, it all takes place on U.S. terms, because frankly it doesn't. And I think the other point where I'll just own my liberalness is to insist that counterinsurgency is not the same as nation building. Counterinsurgency is done by the military with civilian support for specific military aims, right? And that may include some components of nation building, but the idea that, I mean, and maybe the phrase nation building has no meaning independent from military operations, but there is something else that you do when you want to help a society build itself up and strengthen its civilian institutions, and you don't do that at the point of a gun. And it doesn't work.
I guess I would say that counterinsurgency under Petraeus and the military today means building local institutions that have credibility among the population, so that you win over the population so they will inform on the insurgents. And that includes everything from hospitals that treat everybody to credible police departments and the kinds of, and building those institutions. And the military has done that because we've tried it in two places where we invaded, Afghanistan and Iraq. And in the future, sure, you can help do nation building in countries without having the military do it. And it would be in a different context if there wasn't an insurgency. But in the context of Afghanistan, it certainly is something it seems that the military is doing. And they measure their outcomes, and they measure their success in a lot of ways by how good, how the level of corruption in the ministries at the provincial level, the local level, and the federal level. So in that respect, it's there are similarities. Of course, there's differences as well. I mean, I just would point out that this is Barack Obama. Barack Obama, increased the war in Afghanistan. Right now, we'll see. I suspect that there will be a stay-behind force in Iraq, based on what Gates and others have said in the last month or so.
Yeah, it's very interesting to watch the Iraqis tie themselves in knots about whether they're going to ask for one or not, which I think is sort of the key thing to point out here. That I think it's
right.
That there is a genuine concern among some Iraqis with it that there is this demand sort of from the Iraqi side. And Eli, I think it's also sort of like when we say. The other sort of interesting thing, sort of connection that you could make, and maybe this is a good last thought, is does the death of bin Laden also let us finally move to start declaring the death of counterinsurgency? And one of the reasons, frankly, that counterinsurgency is going to die and is going to recede from the incredible prominence it had in American military doctrine for a few years is that it actually turns out that the American military has many things it's really good at, but doing the kind of long-term civilian infrastructure development that counterinsurgency theory presupposes, the military is not that good at. Which
USAID is good at that?
No, USAID is good at it in the circumstances where it's allowed to do it on its own terms. Nobody's good at doing it in combat zones. And counterinsurgency theory makes a lot of suppositions about what can be accomplished in a combat zone that, frankly, the evidence is pretty thin on. And that is one of the reasons that it's, we're not going to try this again at this scale.
I think that's right. On this point, we're going to find a strange. I think you're absolutely right that the era of big Operation Iraqi Freedom or Enduring Freedom invasions of countries where you set up garrisons and stay there for years on end is over.
While telling yourself that you're transforming the societies from the garrison.
Well, I think there's no. I mean, listen. I think that there's no doubt about it. Killing Saddam Hussein and de-Ba'athifying Iraq did transform Iraq, and in the long run for the better. But that said, you're right. Eli,
I don't necessarily agree, but that's a long philosophical discussion, and whatever the hell that was, it isn't counterinsurgency. I mean, I think we can agree that
counterinsurgency doesn't start until, in earnest. But you're right, the era of these invasions is over, and I don't think that there's any reason why, I don't think anybody in the debate right now who thinks about it would say, no, we need to still invade countries. Of course, you can't imagine other circumstances, but the future is going to be special operations working clandestinely with subnational groups, with tribes and other groups in countries, and pinpoint operations and things like that. And that is, I would argue, back to our original debate in this, a more unilateral world because of the secrecy and who's doing it than a multilateral one, and one that continues where the U.S. has kind of its own writ over the what CENTCOM, Central Command, has called ungoverned spaces.
Okay, so Eli, my concluding thought is, and so first, as I said earlier in this dialogue, that's kind of back to the past in terms of how the U.S. operated. But second, if we find ourselves in a world 5 years from now where what we're doing with special ops around the world is more, where we think that's more important and more transformative than what we're doing through our economic, diplomatic, social, cultural, whatever you want to call it, efforts to make our place in the world and alter the balance of power in our favor. If what we're doing with special ops is more important than all of that other stuff, we are in deep, deep trouble as a society.
Well, you can do both. But
we will be doing both, but the question, what you describe implies to me that we go from the situation we're in right now, where what we're doing with our military so far outweighs in importance, in treasure, in attention paid, what we're doing with our non-military sources of power. And if we go from, without changing that relative balance, and we just change from ground troops to special ops, then, first of all, you can't train that many special ops forces to solve, and second of all, many of our really pressing problems are not solvable by assassination, are not solvable by targeted killing.
It's not just assassinations. I think that they're going to find that
Eli,
one of the main
special
things
ops
that
can't deal with the Chinese economy.
Well, I guess what's the comparison? I mean, you do both. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you use special operations forces to deal with a weak dollar.
I want to shift the center of gravity. Is what I want. But I really
in the sense
like
that you want less money for the military and more money for,
Well, at this point we have to have less money for everything. So I'm not so naive that I think about more money for anything, but there does have to be less money for everything. And frankly, if we get out of big counterinsurgency operations, that'll help a lot with less money for everything. But I actually
what about a budget that says this is what we expect the U.S. will have to do in the next 20 years. These are its rivals, and this is the military we'll need to face it.
I'm hoping that the strategic review will actually accomplish that. I actually think if you took the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, that came out more than a year ago, and if you looked at the sort of theoretical part of that, which does imply a post-counterinsurgency world, and if you actually applied the principles in the QDR to the budget, it would be smaller than it currently is. But Eli, that's a topic for another time. And I actually really like the idea that we concluded on the note that that counterinsurgency died with bin Laden.
Well, I don't think it died with bin Laden. I just don't think that we're going to invade any more countries. Yeah. And I would have said that before we were captured.
Right. All right.
And the reason we won't invade any more countries, I think, is because
it didn't work.
What do you mean it didn't work? We got rid of Saddam Hussein, and we'll see what happens in Afghanistan. But I do agree that it's too expensive. It's too hard to sustain, even with a volunteer military, politically, and it creates this thing where you don't want to have a U.S. presence in your country become a distraction for what ultimately you want, which is what ultimately you want is that that there's going to be people susceptible to a poisonous ideology or susceptible to supporting, systems that we find to be a threat. You want the people of that country to sort of be against that, and so you don't want to distract that by having, by stoking their nationalist ire.
Agree with all of that, and I would only add that you also don't want the U.S. doesn't need its presence in another country to distract it from everything else it faces. And Eli, on that note, we really do have to wrap up.
Thanks.
This has been great, and we'll see you next time.